Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Clive Thompson, who is a journalist who writes for New York Times Magazine, also Wired, a couple other publications, and is also the author of two books. This one, I think, from maybe 5 years ago.
Right? Yeah, that's exactly right. 2019. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's called Coders: The Making of a New Tribe and the Remaking of the World. And then the one before that is called Smarter Than You Think, which I guess is about 10 years old. How technology is changing our
11
minds
years
for the better.
Yeah.
Welcome, Clive. So, listen, these books, I think, are very timely, but also I want to hear how you have updated your thinking.
Sure. Yeah.
Because on the one hand, the book Coders, I mean, I think the point you're making is that the coders, well, there's a distinctive culture and mindset and way of doing things associated with coding, software engineering, software development, so forth.
Yeah.
And in a way, with the rise of coders, right? I mean, the number has gone through the roof, up through even up until now. That has had an impact on, I guess, the culture more broadly. I mean, I think right. Weber said something about how the bureaucrat was the the template for the modern human. You said right, there were lawyers in the 18th century, and then civic engineers and mechanical engineers. These are the folks that make the world happen. And I live in the Bay Area, so I'm surrounded by these people.
Yeah.
It's almost like you think everybody's a coder to one degree or another. And at Stanford, 90% of the students will take a course in coding, and coding has kind of taken the place of critical thinking and poetry and pretty much everything.
And Wall Street sometimes too, right? Like a lot of people that would have gone into I want to go into a money profession, so I want to make bank. What started happening after the Wall Street crash was they're like, all right, I'm going to go into coding. And so kind of the bloodless sociopathic sharks who normally would have gone to Wall Street have gone to build software.
Right. Yeah. Well, they say, software is eating the world. And, I make a living by going around and kind of advocating for this position and trying to convince executives that they need to adopt, software in their business and software mindset and so forth. But the idea of a particular type of personality going into coding is one thing. But I think the broader point is that, since everybody's going into it, some of them don't start off with this type of personality, but they kind of adopt it.
The mask becomes the face becomes the mask, right? And I think the other way to look at it too, that the point I try to make in the piece is the ideals of this discipline start to leak out into the world in general. They become the ideals of the way society is supposed to run itself, right? And you sort of definitely in one sense we're seeing that even more than I think I've ever seen it before, because of the ascendance of a certain couple of very powerful high-tech people. Along with the incoming Trump administration, be that Elon Musk, being that some of the top VCs, their ideas about efficiency and waste and whatnot. These are very sort of engineering mindsets, to computer science engineering mindsets that we're seeing that they're trying to visit upon the way a country governs itself. And I suspect there's going to be a fantastic collision there.
Well, look, there's a debate in the world of economics about whether or not learning economics sort of changes your preferences, changes your way of thinking, changes your morality even.
Yeah.
And there's back and forth. Some people say it's selection, some people say it's treatment.
Right. Yeah.
But it's unclear whether it's a good or bad thing, right? So having more people think like coders, this could be a really good thing, or maybe not.
Yeah. Right? No, a double-edged sword is kind of the wrong word for it. I always find that metaphor wrong. It's more like it's a mindset that orients you towards looking at the world in a certain way that can be absolutely phenomenal in many situations, including ones you wouldn't expect it to be useful, and then catastrophic in others, right? And as to this interesting question of yours is, is it which I couldn't quite figure out in my book either. What is it nature or nurture? Like, are you drawn to coding because you are of a very logical mindset, because you are fascinated by these autonomous machines that you can craft to do things repetitively for you, that can be fantastic for sort of allowing for new abilities and for making very slow things suddenly more efficient, or if you start doing that, do you become more like that? I mean, I think in my case, it's interesting. It's a little bit more of the second. Like, I was always a bit of a nerd, because I was part of the first class of computer programmers back in the 80s. We got our hands on like the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64, and I just loved that. Like, I took, honestly, if my mother had let me buy a computer with my own money, which she prohibited, because she was like, no, you'll just sit around playing video games and drop out of high school. In reality, of course, I would have ended up making video games, and then rode that train into the 1980s and 90s software explosion. Instead, I became a writer. But I picked up software programming 15 years ago, again, more intensely. Partly because I was interested in it, partly it's kind of what led to this book, actually. So I can tell you that in the time that I started coding, then it definitely, like, the act of knowing that I had the ability to do this made me start looking at the world a little bit through a coder's eyes in my own life, because I began to notice things that I could be like, wait a minute, I'm doing this with a bunch of repetitive human effort. I could write some software that would do that for me, and suddenly I'd be able to do it much more quickly or more often. And then I could also hand out that power to other people, and then they could do it, right? So that has definitely, so that could argue a little bit towards the second analysis, which is that it's something that the discipline does to you, because I would say it has certainly done it to me. Now, I don't know if that applies to everyone, but that's been my experience.
Well, in the first book, The Smarter Than You Think, I think this book is sort of a contrarian book, right? Because
Totally.
the general,
it was contrarian back then. I mean, you got to remember, even in 2013, the vast majority of intellectuals, were like, the internet is terrible. Like, even in days that we would consider Twitter to be a quaint little fun place to joke about, they were like, no, like, we should be only reading novels, and only abiding by sources of authority, and Wikipedia is just it's actually kind of hilarious now. Like, when I wrote that book, like, defending Wikipedia would get you in trouble, right? Like it is now regarded as this sort of epistemological redoubt of reliability. But back then, it was seen as the rose petal path to hell, basically. Like, people were like, you cannot trust anything that's on Wikipedia. So yeah, it was contrarian. It was contrarian even back then. There was already a strong sense of technology as a very, very bad thing for the caliber of our thinking.
Yeah, I mean, look, my training is as an historian, and so I'm always very skeptical whenever somebody is claiming that there's a trend, right, in a short period of time. And we have a lot of people who are bemoaning the lack of critical thinking and the inability to write, and the dumbification of the world, the shortening of attention spans, and so forth. But I never know exactly, do we have good data on any of this, right? Like, how can we actually say, all right, somebody's attention span now is shorter than it was in 1890 or whatever? I mean,
right.
There are some ways of measuring it, but to what extent are some of these fears, overblown?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question, and it turns out there is some data on these things, but much less than we would like, and much less reliable than we would like, right? Attention spans, they didn't really measure that, before our modern obsession. So we really don't have good data. People will use proxies for it, and some of the proxies are maybe kind of good. Like, for example,
the length of a typical scene in a movie is
one. That's one. That's one. Or although the length of a typical scene in a movie, you could say it's gotten a lot shorter, right? And particularly in action movies, and you could say, well, that's just evidence of us having a shorter attention span. It's also a technological second order effect, because editing just got a lot cheaper and easier, right? Like, I remember when I'm old enough that when I first did a little bit of documentary work, audio documentary this would be like the early 90s. You still had to basically record on tape and then edit that tape, chopping it up with a razor, like a straight edge razor, and taping it together. It was incredibly slow. Like if you wanted to do a fade cut, you did it at an angle. That's how one piece of audio faded and the other one faded out, right? And then, of course, over the next 20 years, actually it's been 35 years since then, audio tools have grown to the point where I can quickly edit a piece of audio. So like the same thing happened with Hollywood. They got their hands on editing tools and made it easier. One of the reasons why you see so many fast cut edits is because they are able to do it. And had those tools been around in 1920, that's maybe what movies would have looked like back then. There's this famous essay that Oscar Wilde wrote in the late 19th century, where there was a trend towards very ostentatious Shakespeare productions with lots of fake smoke during the battles and rising platforms and whatnot. And a lot of critics were like bemoaning it, going, this is sullying Shakespeare. Shakespeare is all about the words, it should just be the words. And Oscar Wilde said, have you actually read Shakespeare's plays? Because he's constantly complaining about how hard it is and how much he wants to do. Every time an actor is on stage talking about plays, they're wishing they could have like lasers and stuff like that. And in fact, actually, the theater in the Round, it burned down because they were using cannons in the middle of a battle scene in Shakespeare, and it caught fire and it burned to the damn ground. Like so like like in one sense,
right?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe our attention spans are shorter, and that's why movies have gotten so quick. But maybe kind of people wanted that, and the editing just caught up to our desires. I mean, it's now I was going to say here's another proxy that people use for attention span, so that I think might be better, which is although it has its own problems that we can discuss, which is like reading of long form books. The deep attention necessary to read a piece of long form nonfiction or a novel, and you can see that tailing off over time. It's the first time it really starts to tail off is when cable TV comes in, because suddenly you have a great competition for attention. And I think
everybody, when I was a kid, everybody was bemoaning the fact that everybody was sitting in front of the boob tube 8 hours a day, right?
Yeah, well, no, exactly. I mean, I sort of argue that like every time people think something really bad is happening in society because of the internet, I'm like, that's certainly true in many cases that I can point to, but we've sort of, no one ever really talks about TV anymore as a problem, particularly news TV, right?
TV was very passive, right? And whereas, I mean, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, the amount of we can get to this, but like the amount of disinformation that there's been some fascinating research done into how like the disinformation that flows online, people often think, well, it originates online and then they push it on TV. But a couple studies have found, no, actually, there's a lot of like absolutely lunatic conspiracy theories that have emerged on far right television that then jump to the online. Like you would see people actually spreading stuff that started off on TV. I actually think that like a significant, I'm kind of with Neil Postman on this one. I think that like the decline in quality of news television is so precipitous and so terrible that it has been just an absolutely ruinous thing for society. And we've sort of stopped talking about it for the last 20 years because we don't know what the heck we could possibly do about it. That's a whole separate argument I have. But anyway, the point being, like the attention span thing with novels. Now, to me, this is interesting because like you can really actually see it go down. And so that's a real data point. And I think that does speak to something going on with attention spans. Like I think that's right. Although it's really hard to tease apart what caused that. I think definitely the internet clearly had to have had some effect on it because people spend so much time online, and because so much of the stuff that we consume now in culture is of short form, like TikTok videos. But there's also some there's just sort of a cultural consensus that has emerged that's really troubling. There's a wonderful Atlantic piece that came out last week. There was someone had written a big reported piece, I guess, in the last issue, and it was about how kids going to college were simply not having trouble reading long books, and professors were talking about how,
well, even like 20-page Harvard cases.
Exactly.
I can't expect anybody to read.
It's
like a 1-page case.
Right.
Right.
It was a profile of all these professors who are wrestling with like, oh my God, how do I teach if I can't assign a damn
Mm.
book? And that's incredibly distressing, right? You know, if you're someone like me who thinks books are, you know, like a certain acme of intellectual activity, and I really do, that's terrifying. But the writer for that piece did kind of a fascinating follow-up just last week where they said, you know, something that I guess maybe they never got to this in the piece, but they said an important point that all these professors kept on talking about was like, there's two reasons why these kids, you know, if you ask professors, why are they not reading these books? Why don't they want to read the books? Why are they unprepared to read the books? The two things that come up a lot is like these kids are like so crazily overscheduled with work to a level that was not at all true when I was in college 35 years ago. You know, I had a lot of free time. You know, if I wanted to read books, there was plenty of time for it. That is not there right now, and I see that in the lives of my teenage kids right now. The demands on them are crazy. And the second thing is, this one's more interesting and a little more troubling, which is that these kids have all gotten the message comprehensively from the adults around them, which I guess includes me, that the books just aren't that important. That you know, you're sort of wasting your time when you could be doing other more productive things. You know, the society doesn't actually reward or encourage that. You know, that's a message they seem to have picked up. And I'm kind of, if that's actually true, I'm very intrigued as to where that came from and how that arose.
But look, I mean, if we think about the coders, the prototypical coders in the coders book, I mean, these people have very long attention spans. I mean,
Oh my God. Yeah.
I mean, they get immersed in
Yeah.
the construction of, you know, the code and,
Yeah.
and, you know, they don't want to be distracted. They don't want to be bothered, you know, and they're building these gigantic castles in the sky, right? And they have to maintain, you know, all the different parts and pieces in their head. And this requires an incredible concentration.
It is. It's honestly one of the things that I like most about writing code myself. There is something absolutely, it requires a level of focus and attention and rewards a level of focus and attention that is absolutely joyful, because it's true. Like what you need to be able to do, and I heard this from everyone I spoke to, and I've experienced it myself, is that because code is very much well, if this thing happens, it will change this other thing. If that thing changes, this thing over here has to happen. And that's also reliant on this other thing. And it's really, it's so hard to get the structure of this in your head that you might spend several hours just looking at what you're trying to do, just thinking about it, sort of getting it in your head. And when it's finally there, then you can begin to do the work. And of course, a couple interesting things fall out of this psychology. One is that you want to stay there. You don't want, it took you 3 to 4 hours to get there, so you don't want to leave. So you want to stay there for 10, 15, 20, 48 hours, right? You know? And so coding tends to select for people who, you know, are able or excited even to go into these like absolute fugue states that can be quite destructive to other aspects of your life, right? You know, to maintaining normal rhythms, to maintaining, you know, healthy sleep and eating habits and exercise habits. The second thing is that if someone interrupts you in the middle of that, it's like you are the narrator of Coleridge's Kubla Khan. Actually, it's not so much the narrator because he wasn't interrupted, but Coleridge himself was writing this ecstatic poem that he'd woken up and it was all in his head. He's like, oh my God, I have to get this down. And someone knocks on his door, the person from Porlock, some business deal, I don't know. And he gets interrupted, and then he realizes when he goes back to the poem, he can't finish it. It's all gone. And so coders hate being interrupted. And that's sort of part of why they're regarded as being such irascible weirdos, is like, you tap them on the shoulder, they'll bite you, right? You know? So you're right. There's something delightful about that mentality of focus. There's something maybe even be learned from it. It's one of the reasons why I realized the more I talk to coders about their attentional needs and the sweep and drama and a sort of epic mental toil, that it reminded me of novelists, of artists, of poets, of the temperament, the mental character of coding is closer to that of an artist than it is to many other forms of engineering, shall we say.
Yeah, and you know, I mostly teach managers, and you know, managing coders, managing software engineers is very different from managing your typical,
Yeah.
line staff, right? I mean, the tempo of an organization that is like, oh, let's have our meetings and then we'll talk about this and we'll talk about that, right? Like that is not going to work, right?
No, no. And I
Folks.
mean, and yes, I mean that there's that famous Paul Graham essay. It's a wonderful essay. Maker time and manager time. I don't, if that's not the exact title, it's close to that. And he basically says, yeah, managers, their schedule is it is a Google Calendar, and it has hour-long increments, and they check in with people to make sure things are going. And that's what they need to do. That's what management is. Coders need, that 10 to 12 straight hours uninterrupted. So if you slot your meeting with them at 1:00, you are basically saying that coder is going to get nothing of consequence done that day, because if it takes them 3 hours to get there, they simply won't begin doing any work at 9 a.m, and they won't begin doing it at 2 p.m. when the meeting's over. They will do nothing. They will do nothing of consequence. They will fiddle around the edges of a problem. And this is exactly, yes, it's a great challenge. It's why a lot of coders who have good EQ, that have good psychological ability to read people, they get kicked up the organizational chart and told, hey, we'd like you to manage things because you understand the way this work works. So you'll be able to manage them with a sort of an eye for a sensitivity to the work rhythms. And the great tragedy of those developers is that often they're very talented at writing code themselves, and they grieve the fact that they don't do it anymore. Like I spoke to one senior manager who had just left Microsoft, Ray Ozzie, and he famously was the chief architect for Microsoft. So he managed thousands of coders and tried to direct them to get them to do good stuff. And he said, I literally remember my last commit, which is to say the last time he published a piece of code, and it was several decades earlier. He was working for Lotus Corporation, and he was working on their spreadsheet stuff. And Mitch Kapoor, CEO, said, Ray, you're really good with people. I want you to stop coding. I want you to manage this team. And so he made that commit, and he still dreams about it 30 years later because he loved that ecstatic feeling of being in the zone and making the code. And that's something that I think he was able to do it a little bit after he left Microsoft. He started a small company, and I think he got a chance to do it again.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's a lot of creativity that goes into coding.
Massively.
Right? I mean,
massively,
you're building stuff, you're making stuff, and you're solving problems. I mean, sometimes the problems I hear about with managers is that coders, they get fascinated. They kind of lose sight of what the business objective is because they just get so fascinated by solving problems that they find are cool that aren't necessarily, value to the company.
Oh no, absolutely. This is a huge problem with managing coders, is that they love learning. I mean, it's in a weird way, it's like you would argue, isn't this an ideal employee? Someone who is eager to learn, constantly learn new things. Very few employees are like, I am just omnivorous. In my spare time, when I'm not being paid, I'm going to do more of this. I mean, how many accountants at your company go home and then from 8:00 at night to 2 a.m, do more accounting, for fun, for just voluntarily, right? That's a coder, right? And what they're doing is they're going home and they're doing crazy new forms of software that they're not really allowed to do at work. But they often try and bring that in, and they'll be like, I'm now obsessed with this framework. Hey, boss, can we use this? And it's like, no, that framework is experimental and not reliable. And I want you to do the same old boring thing we've been doing for 30 years. Because that is reliable, and this is just a very, very hard thing. You're exactly right. There's an excitement in the craft that a lot of software developers have that can be that's not what the job requires. The job requires diligence, patience, maintenance, not building new stuff, maintaining things that exists. There is very little glory in that. It's like, well, I wanted to be someone who built wonderful new things, and here I am, a plumber basically managing leaks, which is what a lot of companies need. They need someone just to keep the system running, but there's a great romance and code of what they call the green field. There's nothing there. I'm going to build an entirely new thing. And that's sort of why, certain ambitious coders will just go off, toss it. I'm giving away my security, I'm going to go do a startup, because that lets you do that greenfield coding at least for a year, while you build something new.
But you also say that the coders don't suffer from the same white page problem that writers face. And having been sort of, dabbled in coding and also being a professional writer, why is coding easier than, I mean, look, I know full well, trying to write is hard and it's super frustrating and you start procrastinating and you get distracted. What is it about coding that is different?
I think you're right. It's true. I'm also a writer, and I get blocked for days, and I avoid writing because I'm, for a bunch of psychological reasons we can discuss. But if I have an idea for a thing I want to do in code, I have no problem just opening up my code editor and immediately starting cranking on it. What's the difference? I think some of it is that coding consists of a lot of small wins. Like, if I want to build something, what's something
so you get feedback. You get immediate feedback.
Yeah, exactly right. Like if I'm, there's something I'm working on right now. I won't bother explaining what it is, but if I do one little thing and get one little function running, I can see that function runs, I can test it, and it's like, wow, that felt great. That took 1 hour. And it's amazing. It's my one Lego brick is laid in place. And I can prove it works, right? Like I don't have to ask someone's opinion. Does this function work? I know it does. I can test it. And writing doesn't work that way at all. Writing is often I find, I don't know if it's the case for you, but it's very bursty. Like I'll sort of, brood over something for a long time, and then a gush of stuff comes out when it was sort of ready to come out. Or I'll have my outline and I'm drafting things and I'm working on it, but the language just isn't quite there. Or maybe I'm happy with it, but my editor isn't, and again, there's no objective or quasi-objective proof that my piece of writing is done or works. Like, I mean, it is as persuasive as I can make it, as persuasive as my editor can make it, and it goes out into the world. But like, I have no sense of clarity that I have with code that this thing, quote unquote, works. And so I think that's why I find, to this day, still find coding a little easier and has certain types of satisfactions that writing doesn't have. Now, writing does have satisfactions that coding doesn't, also. But yeah, it's that white page problem is not there. It's not there for me, and it's not there very often for a lot of coders either. It's very interesting.
I think you quoted somebody says, code wins argument. Right. So, you have an audience for your code, which is the computer, and the computer kind of gives you thumbs up or thumbs down. But you also said that people who work with computers a lot, they get testy because computers are assholes, right?
Yeah.
You said this
100%.
I never thought about that. I never thought, like, you're working every day with this thing, which is just like really pedantic. If you don't spell things out exactly right, then it just sort of, spits back at you. I mean, it's kind of a fun way to look at it. You're basically your employee, right?
It was Jeff Atwood, who was the founder of Stack Overflow, among other things. He said, one of the founders, he said, like I'm working with an abusive colleague, basically. And that colleague is the computer. And computers, when you get something wrong, the compiler sometimes it'll give you a little error message saying, here's what's wrong. But very often, you're on your own. Like it's mysterious what's happening. And you've just got this brick wall, stone-faced machine that's saying, no, I'm not running that code. You've done something wrong. Go figure it out, you stupid human. And it's a terrible feeling. And he thinks, he said so, and I quoted him because I thought it was persuasive. Other people agreed when I bounce it off them, that can, over a decade of that can start to corrode you. It can start to make you feel like, well, this is a perfectly fine way to be. Since the computer is that way to me, I'm going to be that way to other people. And that brusqueness is sort of the, that itself is a type of clarity. Like, I'm going to be as sort of, I guess, binary and Manichaean towards other people as the machine is towards me. And you see that, it's kind of fascinating. That's happening a little bit. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I certainly have. In Silicon Valley, there was this period during the great talent the great fight for talent in the 2010s, when a lot of the large companies were growing rapidly and they couldn't quite get the talented engineers they needed, and so they were bending over backwards to keep their talent happy. Now that there's been some layoffs and shrinkages, there's been this idea of no, wait a minute, we need, we the founders should just be like, like firm jerks to everyone. Screw this, I'm telling you what to do. You do it. You're lucky you're here. You're lucky you have a job. And so like, it's almost like that mentality is like just, you can see it just, leaking at the very top of the stack, as it were.
Well, I mean, I see deep analogies between coding and law. I mean, I'm not, lots of people make this analogy,
sure,
but in a way, you can write what you think is the perfect contract. You can write what you think is the perfect code. And then you find out, right, once you put it into production, that there's some, flaws or some loopholes or whatever. And then you have to go back and patch it. And no matter how much you proofread this thing, you're not going to always catch every possible chink, right? And so there's this iterative process where you have to go back and patch it and fix it. And we're certainly seeing that obviously with these Gen AI models, right? Where you're like, oh wow, I wasn't expecting that, and then we have to kind of go back. I mean, to what extent is it? I mean, you talk about how no matter code review, you spend more time like reviewing code and editing code than you do actually writing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. By the way, that's a great analogy that I'd never heard or thought of before, which is that law needs to be patched the way that software needs to be patched, because it's the same challenge, which is that writing code and writing law, you're trying to create a system that other people are going to use. Humans are going to use it. And so you, the author of the law, or you, the author of the code, have to try sitting at your desk to imagine all the things that those dozens or hundreds or thousands or millions or billions of humans will do with this system. And you can't. There's no way you can, right? So you have to just put it out there and watch and see what they do, and then fix it as it goes, basically. And of course, the more critical the system or the less critical system, the more or less you can get away with. If it's just like a little app for adding bunny ears to photos, who cares if there's some bugs, But when you start to have, I don't know, banking software, criminal code, man, you got to get that stuff as right as you can, because then the bugs are really going to affect people. But, as like say the IRS, you write laws, and then essentially, red team Oppo comes at it and like tries to find all the little bugs and chinks in the armor that allow people with billions of dollars to not pay a red cent in taxes, right? So that's really an amazing analogy. But to go back to your question, this is maintenance. All this patching is maintenance. It's not creation. It's fixing. You're absolutely right. There's a huge amount in the real world of software programming. Unlike what you see in Hollywood, a lot of what you have to do is just fix things as you discover all those bugs come in. You have to. Or not even the bugs. It could be like something changes on the ground underneath your software, like a piece of software that you're relying on changes. Oh, wow. Now we have to change what we do, or like they call them dependencies in software. Like I wrote 500 lines of code, but it relies on 10 different packets of code that actually have 1 million lines. And if one of those starts to change, suddenly I have to change. So a huge amount is maintaining. I called it plumbing earlier. You could also call it like, drywall fixing or, electrical repair. And this is a challenge for a lot of companies, because, developers, again, they like to build. Some of them like to fix, most of them just like to build new stuff. But the brute truth of their job is that they have to spend a lot of time fixing things, and it's not as much fun. And it's tricky to motivate themselves or for other people to motivate them to do that. It's even tricky for myself. So like, here's a little example. I put out this piece of software, like, I don't know, 2.5 years ago, called the Weird Old Book Finder. And it does one simple thing. It's a search engine. You type a query into it. It goes to Google Books. It looks for books that are pre-1924. So they're in the public domain. And it finds, Google will let you find up to 40 books. And it picks one randomly and presents it for you to read. So you type a single phrase in, and it sends you one old book and says, just start reading it. Like, there's not a list of books, go read this damn book. People really love this thing because the books are often really strange from like 1840 and stuff like that. But they often go like, I want to just download the book.
It's kind of like in the old days when you'd wander through the library and you just pull something out of the shelf, right? Yeah.
Stack search, yeah. So, but it's got flaws in it. Like I just wrote it quickly in an afternoon and put it up. I didn't know that it was going to go viral. It went viral, and people are like, "Oh, I want to be able to download the book." I'm looking at it. I'm like, well, if you click on the Google link, it'll take you there, and you can do it. I don't explain this anywhere. I need to just get off my ass and put a button in there that says download this book, and it will do that automatically for you. I've been thinking I should do that for 2 years. I've never done it. Like, I mean, what? Like, that's just basic maintenance that the audience is asking for, and I haven't done because I'm lazy, and it's more fun to build new things. And I mean, now that I've said this out loud, I should just go and do it this afternoon. Basically, it's too humiliating.
You could open source it, right? And
it is open source. It's anyone can use this code, but but this is an area of effort which is small enough that has an audience of one for me. So anyway, the point being, yes, maintenance is a different mentality, and I think there's sort of a lesson for society here too, which is that across society, we have neglected maintenance for decades.
We built bridges, and then we just let.
Exactly. We love to build a new highway and to a new, massive lunar suburb, but we've got all these other roads that we haven't fixed. We have water systems that desperately need fixing. So it's a fractal problem. I think the problem that coders have with maintenance is a problem that a lot of people have with maintenance.
But you also talk about, I think the beginning of the book takes place in 2013 or so, in the early days of Facebook. And this coincided, I think, with this kind of transformation that happened in software, which is, getting rid of the waterfall and just kind of throwing stuff out there, right? Doing agile. Move fast, break things, see what happens, is the Reid Hoffman philosophy. Like, if you're not completely embarrassed by your latest release, then you waited too long, kind of thing. And that, that I think that mentality has spilled over into so much of what we do in almost every domain, right?
No, that's true. And in fact, actually, that attitude goes a little even earlier than you said. I think that story is from like 2008, actually. So the origins of that kind of, get rid of this waterfall idea, let's just put something out there and refine it, was very much the spirit that came out of, I guess really, if you were to say where it came from, it was Web 2.0. It was the beginnings of like people putting up a little tool online that was intended often for social use. A lot of people are going to be using it. And the idea was to provide some minimum level of stuff you could do, and then just watch and see what people would do with it. It was partly because I think and this is the smart epiphany of that type of development, by the way, which is that the creator of the software, the author of the system, I'll have an idea of what I think people are going to do, but I don't really know what they're going to do. And the only way I can see that is to observe them. And then as they gravitate or as they ask for things, then build those things, right? Here's a good example. Around that time, there was before Google Docs existed, there was a company called Writely, and their idea was, we're going to put a word processor, in the browser on the cloud. And this is the middle of the aughts, and they did it. And I talked to the team, and they said, well, our original spec, if you were to walk into our office, we had a list, we had a whiteboard of all the features that we were going to put into this word processor, and it looked basically like we wanted to replicate Microsoft Word. So we had to have tables, and we had to have, indenting, and we had to have different fonts and whatnot. And, we were just checking those off. We put it online, basic functionality, like 3 fonts, that's it. People started using it. Tons of people started using it. They loved the idea of a word processor in the cloud. And they all immediately sent emails into us, thousands of emails saying, all we want is the ability to simultaneously edit a document with someone else. Like, they didn't care about fonts. They didn't even care about italics. What they wanted was for me to be in there and my friend in Illinois to be in there and us editing it together. So once they got that feedback, they're like, all right, let's throw that whiteboard out and let's just work on real-time collaboration. And they realized that was their product. And to this day, you sort of look at Google Docs and you're like, yeah, that's the product. It's not a great word processor, but it's very, very good at letting you work with other people, because that Google Docs bought rightly, and that became Google Docs. So like it's a good process. When it works well, it's a good process. It goes off the rails sometime though.
But I think that, part of this trend though means that the code is less beautiful, right? You talk about elegance, and there's this idea that, everything becomes spaghetti code, particularly when, everybody is now a software engineer, and you can, cut and paste and drag and drop, and particularly now with Copilot and with, all these new tools that, promise, and this is where I wanted to go with this. I've been thinking now that everybody's going to be a software engineer. Mm-hmm. I invested in a company that was built on the premise that we had to teach software engineering to everybody. And yet now I think we're going to have people that are going to be spinning up code who don't actually have any formal training in any software languages, right? So are we just going to get this? I saw a clip on a little meme on Facebook where they were complaining about Gen Z developers who just like, cut and paste all sorts of junk, and as long as it works, it works. But why should we care about elegance?
First off, I think you're right. I think that the LLMs and their ability, large language models, and their ability to generate code is very impressive, and it works pretty well at simple tasks. But a lot of what people want to do are in their everyday lives are simple tasks. But they, like, what you consistently find in the history of coding is that, you've got coders building, things that a million people want to do, and they have to aim for the average. But in the everyday life of a company, there's someone who's like, I got to do this one weird thing. And it's very specific to me. Like I've got this document every week that comes in, and it's got it's now 90 pages long sales report. And I've got to extract just the figures for the Northeast corridor, and I got to put them into a database, and I'm going to run a sort on those so I can find out city by city what our sales were. And they would do this manually, and it's like, there's your Friday, right? But at every company, often there was one weirdo, often a nerd who probably in a different life would have been a computer programmer. And they sort of sat down and they figured out, using something like Visual Basic, which is a really easy language, how to build some totally kludgy mess, like just the ugliest code you've ever seen. And they figured out how to get this to happen. So with one button push, you do it. They revolutionized their company. And this piece of software sticks around for 20 years. No one even really knows how it works. It's like some artifact from the elder gods that was handed down. And if it ever breaks, they're in real trouble. So what LLMs are really going to be, I think, transformational for is, once engineers figure out how to let individual people at companies express their need for this one little task. Could you just do this for me? And they can make it happen. That is going to be explosive. Now, it's not that easy to do. You have to dot a lot of I's and cross a lot of T's to get that to work well. But the companies that can make that happen, I think, will reap enormous benefits for a lot of people. And you will essentially find exactly what you said, everyday people creating and slinging code, not necessarily themselves being the coders, it will have that effect. It will still have the effect of Visual Basic problem, where there's a lot of code being generated. No one really knows how it works. It's kicking around. It's kind of mission critical, but no one can fix it when it breaks. It's going to have these second order problems, right? It's going to be LLMs do not write clean code. It's often pretty ugly stuff. I've used it myself. I use it myself, but they generate it and have to fix some things, or it kind of works, but it doesn't really work in all circumstances. It's going to be a very weird world we're heading towards. I think you're right. I think you're exactly right.
But is this world going to be one where we still need kind of software engineers? What will happen? Will we need more? Will we need fewer? One way of thinking about it is that each software engineer is going to be way more productive. And so that means that there'll be more demand for it, because the amount of software in everything will just explode through the roof, right? So we'll still need plenty more software engineers. The other thing would be, even if you are someone who's just spinning up these tools with LLMs, you still need to kind of understand the underlying logic, right? So, I mean, if 95% of the students at Stanford are taking an intro to coding class, do you think that everyone should? I mean, I know a lot of people in high school are taking trigonometry. I mean, that's a complete waste of time. Shouldn't they be taking coding?
I've often read and found persuasive some of the arguments behind reforming math education, which is that like calculus and trigonometry are intellectually gorgeous. I mean, I like them myself just because I'm a math head, but but less practical in everyday life compared to something which is neglected, which is statistics and probability,
Yeah, yeah.
which really is critical to helping to understand the world and doesn't require anything more than basic addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division, right? Like you can do this with like a regular 12 key calculator. And that's what we ought to demand every high school.
Yes. I mean, you teach statistics because you want them to understand inference, right? So, so inference and logic are just incredibly important skills.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so
where do you get inference and logic, right?
And exactly. Programming is a wonderful way to help to think logically and to be able to I mean, I think that like if computer programming at a basic level were much more well taught and across high schools, then that would really unlock a lot of the value of these LLMs, because like it is true what you said is exactly right. They will generate something, but unless you know enough coding to look at it and go, well, that's not quite right, let me fix that. Then they're not as useful, and they can even maybe be a little harmful, because exactly right. We're still going to need software developers, quite a lot of them. In fact, we may, I mean, honestly, every time historically, you study history. I look at the history of technology. Every time a new technology came along that we thought was going to sort of relieve us of labor, what it often ended up doing was making more of that labor possible and more people. And so the amount of labor increases. Like instead of replacing the existing, people making Twitter, people making, Mastodon, whatever, it sets people free to say, I'm going to write software to solve a problem that no one has even thought of using software for yet, right? And that's like, when lighting got cheaper, we didn't just suddenly drop our bills with lighting for cities. We started putting lights on sneakers, and on bicycle spokes, and this is sort of this way you can think of code, like code suddenly starts getting used in all these crazy places, sometimes for fun, stupid reasons, right? Like a lot of it could just be weird cultural code, which is kind of the stuff I write. Like often things are like fun little weird jokes. So yeah, I'm not one of the people that believes that we're going to need less software engineers. We're still going to need them. I think we're probably going to see, we have the potential for people to be automating. And here's the other way to think about it, by the way. There's this great essay that I read years ago, and I wrote a blog post sort of reiterating it. And it was a guy, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. The headline was, "Don't learn to code, learn to automate." And he basically said, what you really want to do is you want to be able to take something, and this is what all programmers love, take something that's inefficient in your own life and make it efficient. Take something that you can figure out how to do it really well once, and then just have it run on autopilot so it's done for you over and over again. And when I express it to people that way, I say, like, should I learn to code? I say, no, don't learn to code, but you might want to learn enough coding that you can automate boring, dumb things that you have to do every week in your job or life. And then you see their eyes light up and they're like, holy crap. And that's part of what LLMs and a little bit better computer programming teaching could unlock.
Well, I mean, you talk a bit about how this mentality spills over into other aspects of life.
Yes.
And, we see this with economists. They kind of, they ingest this idea of efficiency, and it goes into other realms. I mean, I have a relative who, he will do almost anything to avoid anything that looks like, work. And it's like, hey, take out the bag of leaves. And he's like, well, if it dries out, it'll weigh less. And it's like, well, I mean, like,
technically speaking, it's correct, but you're going
to the gym, right? Like, why wouldn't you, why is lifting a heavier bag worse than lifting a lighter bag? And there's certain aspects of life where maybe efficiency is misguided.
Very, very much so. And this is a great collision between the engineer's love of efficiency, which reaches, I would argue, a real acme with computer software, because it allows us to build machines not just to do things physically for us, but do things to do it mentally for us, cognitively for us, aesthetically for us. So the sort of tendrils of efficiency can reach into ever more nooks and crannies of everyday life. And so what we've found is, is that like is that as laudable as those efficiencies often are, they sometimes get pushed into areas where, wow, we're speeding up something that works better for society when it's slower. And so I've been most impressed by software engineers.
What's the drink? The
Red Bull.
No, the Soylent, right?
Soylent, yes, exactly. Yeah. Why would I need to like experience food when I can just when I can and in fact, actually, Bram Cohen, who's the guy that created BitTorrent, who's really one of the most talented programmers I or anyone else has ever met. It just like universally recognized as a real genius. But he himself was so obsessed with efficiency that I was hanging out with him. I was writing about him for Wired, and he's like, I think his wife had said, Bram, have you eaten anything? It's like 1 PM. He's coding. He's like, all right, I'll go get a sandwich. So he's like making a peanut butter sandwich like in like, I don't know, 15 seconds and eating it. And he's like, sometimes I wish, he said this to me, I was like a Terminator robot in the Terminators where you could just install a cube of energy in your chest and then you're fine for like 6 months, because all he wanted to do was code. Anything else, the maintenance of this sack of meat that you earthlings call a body, was just an inefficient drain. And he's not the only one that feels that way. A lot of people, feel that way. But yeah, there is the efficiency obsession, which is kind of what I wrote a whole chapter about. Really goes off the rails when it starts to be visited upon areas that where efficiency is not only not good, but it might be really bad. And for example, anything where you need to pay attention to one human, to take care of them, to listen to them, to understand them, you can't make that efficient. You just can't. And whenever you try to, like, we're gonna have robots do that or whatever, it just turns into some absolute dystopic nightmare. And so this is where things kind of go off the rails. And I think we see this often. I mean, I'm seeing this collision now with the idea that like the Department of Government Efficiency that Trump is setting up with Musk. The idea that like all this government stuff is just absolute rotten nonsense. And like, God knows there's enormous efficiencies in government that I think legitimately could be looked at. But every time they offer examples, it's stuff that's like, no, this is just a cheap joke about actual science. It's really doing something, right? Like stuff that seems inefficient is actually just, it's just patience. It's the fact that government does stuff that like, we start it now and we won't see the benefits for 10 to 15 years. And a lot of for-profit efficiency-minded engineering stuff just doesn't think in those terms, right? Like if you were to think just about efficiency, you wouldn't do some of the audacious long-term planning infrastructural things that a society needs to do to sort of really thrive, to build the operating system for actual wealth and human thriving. That stuff is does not it often doesn't look very efficient when you look at it up close, but then you think about it 30 years later, you're like, holy crap, I'm glad we did that. So this is where you can start to see collisions between a like my own. I mean, I'm implicating myself in this. I have that efficiency mindset myself. Like I chafe at these things. I try and automate things, and then I'll realize this is crazy. Why am I doing this? Like I'm speaking from inside the belly of that beast, shall we say?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I was wondering, this book's Smarter Than You Think. If you had to rewrite it now with generative AI, I mean, would you have to take a slightly different take? I mean, the big problem that I see with generative AI is that, people are falling asleep at the wheel, quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
They if it can be used either to stimulate creativity, to generate new ideas, or it can just be a way of mailing it in, right?
Yeah, 100%. If generative AI were around, I mean, what I would have to do is I would have to sort of figure out. I mean, when I wrote Smarter Than You Think, my technique was if there is some area where technology is affecting how we think, which is to say, loosely, how we learn things, how we talk about them to ourselves, to other people, how we express ourselves, how we formalize ideas, how we take action on them. Then what I wanted to do is I wanted to see, I wanted to find people who are kind of doing really interesting and impressive things with it and learn
Like
from them.
you were looking at centaurs, right? These
Yeah,
centaurs are the
exactly. Yeah,
people,
the centers, people who
they're the ones that
brought their
really
human
interface
intelligence
well.
and merit it. So I would probably have done that with large language models. I would have said, well, okay, if this is useful in any way, is there a way? How are people who are using it to do genuinely intellectually or aesthetically or civically, awesome things? What are they doing? I'm sure, and I'm sure those things absolutely exist. But I would have also had to grapple with sort of the downsides of like this problem of like, if you couldn't be bothered to write it, why would I be bothered to read it? That's the sort of the problem of the use of LLMs at scale, this cheapening of the very idea of human expression, to the point where it sort of doesn't really matter whether this is right or whether this is good or persuasive. The box just needs to be filled. The memo just needs to be written. And there's an extent to which, like, the adoption wholesale of LLMs by students, by people, office drones, is, can be seen as a wholesale condemnation of the way we educate and the way we run companies, which is to say, like, if it's actually possible for these like hyper autocomplete systems, that have great context, to successfully write papers at a high school or college level, or to write memos for a company, well then, why were we aiming so damn low? Like, like what is really going on here? Does any of this work actually mean anything? And of course, like a critic of education, mass scaled education, including, like, say, like people, reformers from the early 20th century, would have said, yeah, I could have told you that in 1923, that having 30 kids in a classroom staring at a board and having to write papers is the stupidest possible way to educate people, and it's not really going to do anything other than turn them into mimics, which can then be automated using LLMs, right? But here's the thing: like, if I were to go back and rewrite Smarter Than You Think today, or if I could get into a time machine and go back and say, hey, Clive, here's Clive from 14 years in the future, or 11 years in the future. Here's what you need to know. What I needed to understand that I didn't understand back then was how much the market dictates were going to deform the way that a lot of social software developed, right? Because in the early days of social software, the algorithmic juking was much lower. Generally, when people were sharing things, you kind of saw what they wanted to share, And what happened over the next 10 years was that they turned that, the sort of thirst for advertising eyeballs, caused all these companies, one after another, to shitify by basically creating their systems so they're like, well, we need to keep people constantly sort of enraged, or constantly laughing their heads off, or constantly experiencing some hot emotion. And so we need to create systems, machine learning systems mostly, just good old fashioned AI, not LLMs, to identify, what is the heat signature of something that's most likely to provoke an incredibly hot reaction of intense laughter, intense rage, intense piss offness, and shove that to the top of the feeds. And if I'd have known that was the way things were going to go, I would have written a lot more cautionary stuff about that in the book, basically, because I think that is really where things have gone off the rails. It's why, for the last 2 years, my main social network has been Mastodon, where there is absolutely nothing but a reverse chronological feed. There's nothing, and it's in a weird way. This is circling back. It's more inefficient to use. Like, you don't get the heroin injection of instant stuff. You're like panning for gold more, but you also don't get the whole thing going off the rails with these like hyper viral surges of craziness. And I've been using Blue Sky, and it's been the same way, except they just announced that, I think we're going to maybe start, boosting replies that have, a lot of juice to them. I'm like, oh yeah, I can see where this is going. In a couple of years, it's just going to be like, just, filled with like people screaming at each other because that's what the algorithm has sort of pushed the stuff in front of them, basically. So that
Yeah.
is one of the main things I would have done. I would have said, like you need to think more clearly about what the profit motive is going to do to some of these social networks. Yeah.
Well, I mean, economists, I think, are good at that. I don't know if you saw this. There was a Stanford professor who submitted a court document arguing in favor of this law that would criminalize deep fakes, and his his testimony was actually filled with fake references. It's like you can't make this
Yeah.
stuff up, right? You can't make
Yeah.
this stuff up. But
Oh my
I guess
God.
last question. I mean, you talk about you mentioned these 10x or 100x coders,
Yeah.
and I was out last night with a friend of mine who is a founder and VC, and I said, "So what do you think about this? I mean, is this a real thing?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, I mean, of course." He said, um, sometimes there's 10,000x coders, right? It's a power law. I mean, it's just this huge long tail of people who are just phenomenally good, and I imagine that there are a lot of domains in life where this is
Yes.
true, right? Certainly with artistic production and probably active trading and financial markets and stuff,
I mean,
and of course,
I think it's true with any craft. I mean, I know
yeah.
plumbers who can diagnose a problem in 30 seconds that like the 30 lousy plumbers would never diagnose, right?
Yeah, and I'm wondering, I mean, does this shape the way in which people think about the world, and does it influence their politics in a way, right? I
Mm,
mean, kind of, if you're 100 times better than the person in the next cubicle, like, why shouldn't you get paid 100 times more, right? And,
right.
I think
Yeah.
Google came to this realization that they had to, if they really wanted to move forward, they had to have this very, very steep pay gradient. And of course, if you believe this, then
Yeah.
presumably you look around and you think, well, okay, this is the way the world is
Right.
is going to be, right? I mean,
Right. Right.
is that shaping some of the politics?
Yeah, I absolutely, I think it does. Although I think it does because the people who really believe the 10x thing are only understanding one part of it, which is that it's absolutely true that there are people who, in certain circumstances, just wildly outperform others. But there's a bunch of complexities to it that everyone explained to me, including the 10x coders themselves, who are like, here's the thing. I'm a 10x coder in this context, and I'm not in other contexts. I need other people to do that stuff for me. And there are, so like I'm valuable here, but I'm reliant on other people being great in other
Mhm.
areas. So like I like all software creation is now a massive team affair. Um, Part of the mythology of 10xing really comes from early stage startups, right? So like the company is only 3 people, it's only 4 people, and it's all greenfield coding. There's no maintenance happening yet, right? And what you see in those situations is that there definitely are people who are able to imagine the whole product and just grind through and produce really good stuff and get things off the ground in like 5 months in a way that is just absolutely remarkable. Um, and a lot of the people who are at the top of the pole of Silicon Valley with money now either experienced that themselves or were adjacent to that. The problem is, as Google knows, as anyone running a large company knows, that level of productivity is not only unnecessary for a mature company, it's actually hazardous for a mature company because your product is evolving way faster than you can than you can account for quality and for reliability. Because this is like, again, the early stage ones, who cares if there's a bunch of bugs in that? We're just doing something fun for new people. So a lot of these people have taken that text coding thing and believe that it applies everywhere, and it really doesn't. It applies really strongly in certain key situations. And once you have a mature company, what really defines a 10x coder is someone who is incredibly experienced up and down the entire stack of your company, maybe been there for 20 years, maybe was the person who wrote those first 10,000 lines of code, understands the company, and can walk into any problem that a team of 5 people are having and unblock them by going, I think the problem you're running into is that API that we wrote 7 years ago is probably burping whenever this API over here tries to talk to it. And they're like, oh, that's right. And then that 5-person team has to spend 7 months fixing that problem slowly and patiently. They are doing the maintenance. They're doing the spackling. They're doing the plumbing. So you're correct that everyone's correct in saying those people exist, but the idea that this leads to a Superman mythology where we are all like essentially like the proles in Atlas Shrugged who will all starve if these guys go on strike is completely not at all describing the way like actual modern mature complex companies go. And so it's like, yeah, it's definitely part of the story. Is it the way software gets made? No, like not at scale.
I wonder if generative AI is going to compress that distribution somewhat, right? So there is the analogy that is often used that, prior to the introduction of the tractor, if you were a really strong man, you could plow more than if you were a really weak man, right?
Right.
And then with the tractor, you can put the scrawny, sickly person on the on the seat. He can plow just as much as the burly man.
Totally.
And there's the BCG study and all that. I mean, do we think that Gen AI is going to allow somebody who's kind of a crappy coder to become level up with someone who's better?
I think no, actually. I think I could be wrong, and like I'm like maybe this will surprise me. Like if they get as they figure cooler ways to make these models better and better, which I'm certain they will do. Like this is engineering. Engineers they're good at engineering, right? But my suspicion is that the complexity of the way that really serious software works, particularly software that has to interact with the world, that there are so many weird little edge cases and stuff that you're still going to need people that are like exceptionally good at understanding how to pull things together and how to use these LLMs in the right way. I think we're going to see it more. I think where it's going to actually where it might 10x people is in the sketching out an iteration of ideas and getting kind of the first version of this thing working. Like it might definitely dramatically accelerate the ability of an entrepreneur who is not particularly a skilled coder to kind of get that first alpha working, that it does something cool and new, that like they can then go, okay, now I've got $10 million and I can hire some real, badass programmers to help turn this into something solid. That absolutely I can see happening, where someone who doesn't have a lot of great coding skills, but has like Steve Jobs-like ability to imagine a product that doesn't exist, can use LLMs to get themselves up to that stage. But will they be able to make something that can resist being pounded on by 1 million people at once, or reliable enough that it conforms with I don't know, government reporting things? If you're doing something for, say, the military, no, I think probably gonna need humans for that for some time. But LLMs are a remarkable tool within the ecosystem of how people achieve things in software, and they'll get more remarkable as time goes on, I expect.
Yeah, and I love this analogy that you have at the beginning of Smarter Than You Think, right? You talk about how the people who are going to be the best coders with these tools are not going to be the same people who are the best coders without these tools. And you use this from the chess, right? These people who are like rated number 1700.
Yep.
That when they had access to the computers, they could beat the number 1 in the world with access to.
Yep. Right? Yeah. Gary Kasparov said, it's talent plus process, right? It's like you have to be good enough at chess that you understand the way chess works, but you have to be good enough at using chess software to understand how to use it the best. And when you put those two together, you are way better than anyone else. Like someone who's way better at chess than you, but doesn't really understand how the software works, is not going to get to your level. And so someone who really understands how LLMs work well and is also like a coder, maybe not like the best coder, put those two together, that's going to be an unbelievably powerful censure without question. I mean, I can already see this myself, right? Like I am not a particularly talented coder. Like I am a hobbyist. I hack my way along. But now that I've had LLMs, I can go from having a weird little idea to having something up and running in, I'm talking like 15 to 20 minutes to half an hour that would have taken me maybe like 5 hours before. Like it goes really fast. And if that's happening to me, imagine how that's happening to people who are actually, trained coders who can really use these tools. Like to me, it's quite impressive. And I think we could really start to see some interesting stuff happen at that grassroots level of company formation and idea formation. That's probably what I'm most excited by, I think, in some respects.
Now you got a new book coming out in a year or two, and you're already deep in the weeds. It's a little bit of a departure. Can you give us a short summary of what you're working on?
It's a bit of a departure, although it is a technology book, because it's ultimately about it's a story of me cycling across the United States. I left my house here in Brooklyn on a bike with all my stuff in a bunch of bags, very heavy bags, 70 pounds of bags. The bike was about 100 pounds before I got on it. And I rode it all over the Appalachian Mountains, all over the Great Plains, all over the Rockies until I got onto the Pacific coast and dipped my tire in the ocean. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to see the way the country moves, how it does its mobility, how people get from point A to point B everywhere, inside dense urban cities, inside huge suburbs, inside the middle of big, empty, sprawling plains, because I want to write about what the energy transition is going to look like for mobility. How are we going to decarbonize as much as possible American mobility? Where is it possible to rely a little less on large vehicles to move people and things around? Where are we going to need those vehicles forever? And that being the case, is it possible to say electrify them? And that was sort of the goal of the book. It's also kind of a fun memoir, because I'm a nerd, so I didn't play any sports, I didn't exercise for like 30 years until my 40s, when suddenly, partly because my younger kid loved the idea of going on long bike rides, started becoming a long distance cyclist. Like I went from like someone who would ride maybe a couple miles to someone who would ride 500 miles, for fun. And this shocked no one more than myself. So it's sort of a memoir of what it means to sort of, to revamp my own relationship to mobility. There's this line that occurs early in the book where I say, like, one of the things that fascinates me about thinking about myself and what I'm newly capable of, and what the US might be capable of if we could reform its, the way that people move around, as I go, the US and I have something in common. We are both pieces of aging infrastructure. And so I'm kind of interested in what the potential for both of those systems is. And that's kind of what the book's about. So it's a lot of, there's in one sense, it's different, but in the other sense, this is all a technological story, because it's all about, the electrification, the way we move things around, how environments that are built, be they software or the physical world, how they affect what we do, and how the affordances of the technologies we have around us for mobility affect us. One of the most fascinating things has been writing about, I'm a cyclist, but writing about the emergence of e-bikes, which are like literally transforming the entire area of cycling. Like, I actually think 10 years from now, you're going to have to go out of your way to buy a bike that isn't an e-bike. Like, it's going to be a weird specialty item. Like, you have to go to the store where, like, oh, you're one of the weirdos that still wants to pedal this thing just with your own meat legs, right?
Manual transmission.
Exactly. It's going to be manual transmission. And there's some studies that suggest, and this is really mind blowing, they really need to be followed up. No one knows this is true because they're just estimates, but you could spec it out if you got really good telemetry. Anyway, what they suggest is that e-bikes might produce less carbon emissions than a regular bike, which is to say the carbon emissions of the surplus food needed for me to eat to be able to power my bicycle might be lower than the carbon emissions needed to generate the electricity that the e-bike uses.
But it's healthier to pedal, right?
Well, look, one of the reasons, although here's the thing though, they also found that people that ride e-bikes get more exercise than those that typically ride regular bikes, and that's because it's easier to ride, so they ride them more often, they ride them further. Basically,
I see.
It's like they make it up in volume. Like, now me, I'm not an e-bike rider because I'm also in my 50s. I'm in heart attack territory. So I like getting the exercise. I'm wildly more fit than I was 6 years ago. And so I live in New York City. So like just yesterday, my friend's like, come meet me for a drink. They live in Harlem. And I'm like, okay, I'll come up to you. They're like, no, let's meet somewhere halfway. I'm like, no, I'm coming to you, because then I'll get 26 miles of riding and I will forestall me stroking out in the middle of a podcast.
Well, that's very inefficient of you. It's like I took the the BART yesterday from the Warriors game, and of course, every time I see stairs instead of escalator, I take the stairs. But I'm fully aware that it is inefficient.
It is more. Yeah, exactly. Like I'm doing something. Although here's the thing, though, it's more, in one sense, it's more inefficient. On the other part, it's like I get there just as fast, if not faster, than the subway. Frankly, I often get there faster than you could in a car because traffic in Manhattan is so terrible. But here's the most fun part. I wrote an essay about this. I know when I'm going to get there, because if you get on the subway in New York City, you're probably going to get there roughly on time. But, the chances are significant there's a delay and you're going to be 10 minutes late and you're like sitting there chafing and your stomach's all in a knot because you're late for your friend. If you get in a car, it's Russian roulette. You have no idea when the hell you're going to get there. Like there could be like some, I don't know, like a cement truck, stuck on a one-way street that can't get around, and you're sit there for 15 minutes. You get on a bike, I know exactly when I'm going to arrive there. There is no real significant traffic. There's just the linear equation of my legs pumping. Or as I like to say it, riding a bike feels like the most meritocratic thing I do, where the relationship to effort and result is 1-to-1, and it never changes. And there's something about that feeds the soul. So anyway, this is all stuff that I talk about in the book. It's a lot of fun.
Well, great. Clive, thanks so much for joining me. The books are Coders and Smarter Than You Think, with a new one on its way. We'll talk again soon. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I had a great time.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.